Hello, everyone. Wow, this is so cool to be speaking here. My name is Ashlyn Butler, and I am from the Rutgers University Forestry Club. And I'd like to thank the Shade Tree Federation for having us here. It's a really cool opportunity for us, so appreciate it. So I probably would not be standing here if it weren't for the next speaker. She was a part of the team that actually reinstated the Forestry Club back in 2019, and I'm so proud to be part of such an amazing organization. So thank you to Mary Charlotte Gitlin. She is a consulting ecologist and urban forester. Using her certifications and education from Rutgers University, she works to properly and proactively manage urban forests, and in doing so, she hopes that she can do her part and inspire others to help in the fight against climate change. In Ms. Gitlin's talk titled Urban Forest Rethink and Ecological Systems Approach, she will outline the current problems in the urban forestry system and their potential solutions. She will also open up a dialogue to discuss how we can use urban forestry to make communities more livable under the umbrella of climate change. I am honored to welcome Mary Charlotte Gitlin.
So secondly, through my ecological lens, I'm an urban forester, and I look at the urban forestry system and all those interactions in there. Some big components of that: trees, people, sidewalks, everything you think of that tends to be an issue in urban forestry. And I'm also an arborist. So an arborist is someone who cares for trees, and I'm a New Jersey licensed tree expert and an ISA certified arborist. And lastly, I do all of this in the role of a private consultant. So with Paul Cowie and Associates, we make recommendations for the care and maintenance of individual trees and populations of trees. So now that you know a little bit about me, I want to get to know who you guys are. Put your hand up if you are a shade tree volunteer and you sit on a commission or committee. That's a lot. Awesome. How about anyone who's a municipal employee? Specifically, Department of Public Works. Cool. Yeah, we work with you guys quite a bit. How about licensed tree care operators or licensed tree experts? A few. Okay, there's more of you in the other room. So your mission today, what I am asking of you for the next hour or so, is to be open to new possibilities in urban forestry management. A lot of the solutions I'm going to talk about today are easy and can be implemented essentially overnight, and a lot of them aren't and would require a lot of resources, a lot of time, a lot of figuring out, and are just generally harder to do. So I'm asking that you're open to some of those more difficult urban forestry solutions and don't just write them off because they're hard, but think about how they could be implemented even with the barriers that stand in the way. So this is our roadmap for where we're going today. First, I'm going to talk about where we are in urban forestry management today. Then I'm going to touch on our goal, where we're going. And then we're going to talk about 4 big ecological interactions in the urban forest: trees and roots, trees and wires, trees and public opinion, and trees and private property. Then we're going to talk about assembling solutions to address these interactions and others. And lastly, we'll talk about that goal one more time. So let's get into it. So today in urban forestry, most of our management is focused on our street trees, specifically our street tree alleys. This row of trees that are often the same species and the same size, more often than not, are in between the sidewalk and the curb. And we plant trees like this because it looks really nice and because we've been doing it like this. This comes from a French formal garden element, so it dates back pretty far. But in this modern age, there are some limits on our street tree alleys that make them not quite as functional as they have been historically. So one of those limits is our overhead wires. Put your hand up if you have seen this picture before. Yeah, so this is right tree, right place. And what this is showing is that because we have such a conflict between our overhead wires and our street trees, we should be planting smaller trees underneath the wires. Okay, well, that is one solution, but kind of hard to have a large maturing species in a traditional street tree alley when there's wires more often than not on at least one side of the street. Another limitation, well, before I get into that, I live just north of Newark, New Jersey, and I was really struck by just the amount of wire up there. Like, of course, this is going to be a conflict with our traditional street tree plantings. And another example of some things that happen when we have large trees under wires, we get things like the slingshot tree. So this is pruned to keep that necessary line clearance, and it can limit the service life of our trees, and it's reducing the amount of canopy that that tree has. Another limitation in our modern street side is those sidewalk and curb repairs. So you can see here that this tree's buttress roots were cut pretty aggressively for that sidewalk repair. So not only does this limit tree health, but this can become a public safety issue because now we've removed a significant portion of those trees' structural roots. And even if that tree has enough structural roots underneath the sidewalk, over time we can expect that this tree is probably going to decay in those buttress roots and in the lower trunk, and that can lead to a higher probability of whole tree failure. Just another example of that, this cut is actually in the lower trunk, so even further up. And so all of these modern limits, those repairs for sidewalk and curb that affect tree health and structure, our overhead limitations, and just the volume of traffic on our streetscapes coming from cars and from our salt de-icing procedures, that gets us our current results. So we have these less than ideal growing conditions, which gives us underperforming trees and reduced environmental services. So again, just to recap, our urban forestry management is really heavily focused on our traditional street tree alleys, but we have a lot of modern limits in our streetscapes that give us a population of underperforming trees and reduced environmental services. So now let's talk about where we're going. Our number one goal in urban forestry management should be to mitigate local effects of climate change. And we do this through two big mechanisms. The first is increasing canopy cover. And this begs the question, how much canopy? Unfortunately, it depends. There was a study done from Dr. Monica Turner's lab at the University of Wisconsin, and it looked at the relationship between canopy cover, impervious surface, and daytime temperature. And what they found was that if there's more impervious surface, we need more canopy to reduce those daytime temperatures. They also found that temperature decreases exponentially with canopy increase. So an increase of canopy from 0 to 20% has some increase on reducing daytime temperatures, but that same 20% increase from 40 to 60% has a much greater impact on daytime temperatures. So the bottom line here is we need more canopy and less impervious surface. And this doesn't go for just daytime temperatures. This also applies to our other benefits of trees, like stormwater, air filtration, all the other great things that I know that we think trees do for us. Our other big way that we use the urban forest to mitigate local effects of climate change is through better trees. And this is the piece I'm going to focus on for the rest of the presentation. We touched on it a little bit in the presentations this morning, so I'm just going to go more into that. So lots of stems does not necessarily mean we have lots of benefits. We know that our older, bigger, and healthier trees do more for us. This is a list of all of the great things that trees do for us, and I really want to emphasize those bottom 2 points, the stormwater management piece and the temperature reduction piece. We know New Jersey is already warmer and wetter as a result of climate change, and we know it will continue to get warmer and wetter. And the urban forest has the potential to help us address those effects locally. But space in our urban forest is limited. Trees are competing for space with things like buildings, sidewalks, parking lots, roads. So we need something called intentional hyperfunctionality. And this is a phrase that I've borrowed from the National Research Council on Urban Forestry. And this is a quote from their workshop summary that I think really summarizes this well. If cities can only afford to allocate limited space to green infrastructure, each unit of green needs to be hyper-efficient if we intend to achieve meaningful reductions in pollution, runoff, and temperature. Green space needs to be deliberately designed to enhance its benefits. So because our trees are competing with everything else in our urban environment, every time we do have a tree or green space, we need to be designing that space so it is providing us with the highest level of benefits possible. So here's what I would consider a hyperfunctional tree and a not so hyperfunctional tree. You can see that tree on the left is a large, mature London plane tree. It's in good health, no structural defects that we can see. It's set back from the sidewalk and the line, so there's not that overhead utility conflict. It is too close to the driveway. You can see it's interfering there, but nobody's perfect. And that's in comparison to our tree on the right, which has very limited soil volume. It's directly under that overhead utility, so it's getting pruned pretty aggressively to maintain that necessary line clearance. And this tree on the right will just never provide that same level of benefits that we will get from the tree on the left. So this is our qualitative comparison. So now we're going to talk about numbers a little bit. How many of you are familiar with iTree? Hands up. Okay, so most people. So for those of you who don't know, iTree is a series of programs from the US Forest Service that seeks to quantify the environmental services of trees. So I ran our 2 theoretical trees through iTree, and I got some numbers back for carbon storage, carbon sequestration, avoided runoff, and pollution removal. These are not the only benefits of trees, but to my knowledge, there's not really a good model for assessing how much impact one tree has on temperature and other less tangible benefits like human health. But you can see that this is the big question, is how many lousy trees does it take to make one hyperfunctional tree? In this particular example, anywhere from 7 to 15 trees. These numbers will vary significantly with the tree size, but size is part of this equation, because a larger tree, again, provides us with a higher level of services, and those trees that are not hyperfunctional will not get to the same mature size as a hyperfunctional tree. So what makes our hyperfunctional trees? They have limited conflicts with other infrastructure, they're in good health, they have good structure. Sometimes you can have a tree that's in good health, but its service life is limited because of the structure. Think of that example I showed with the buttress roots that were cut for sidewalk repair. That tree may be in good health, but if the whole bottom of the tree is hollow and it's not structurally sound, it is at the end of its service life. A hyperfunctional tree has normal maintenance needs, potentially less maintenance needs than others. It's a large species and it's mature. So a tree will not be hyperfunctional for the entire duration of its service life. Whoops, went one piece too far. So these are life cycle curves from Dr. Jason Grabowski. He spoke this morning. And what this is showing here is on our horizontal axis, we have time. On our vertical axis, we have ecosystem services or environmental services. So over the course of a tree's life, it will vary the amount of environmental services that it provides us. So a tree takes a little while to establish. Those environmental services increase. They plateau at some level for the majority of the tree's service life before the costs begin to exceed the benefits and the tree declines and gets removed. So this is where we see that potential for hyperfunctionality. In that mature, established tree, that plateau of environmental benefits. So within this framework, let's compare our lousy and hyperfunctional trees. Our lousy tree might look something like this. Takes a little while to establish, plateaus at a low level of environmental services for a pretty short amount of time before it declines and gets removed. And this is in comparison to our hyperfunctional tree, which maybe takes a little longer to establish because it will reach a larger mature size, and it plateaus at a higher level of environmental services for a longer period of time before the costs exceed the benefits and it gets removed. So those are our 2 big mechanisms, increasing canopy cover and getting better trees, that will help us mitigate local effects of climate change. So now let's talk about ecological interactions that are often antagonistic, but don't have to be, and how we can address those to meet our goal of mitigating local climate change. So the first one here is trees and their roots. So the problem is that tree environmental service yield is often limited by soil rooting volume. And Dr. Bassick talked about this morning, but I'm going to go over kind of why that is just one more time so we're all on the same page. So when things get built like sidewalks and roads, the soil gets compacted to an engineering standard that is great for supporting that pavement, but not so great for tree growth because it squishes out all of that pore space. So even if trees can penetrate the compacted soil, they don't have access to the air and water that they need that typically exists in a soil matrix. So that's really how the soil rooting volume limits tree growth. And some solutions to addressing that are, first, we can plant trees on the lawn side of the street. This is an easy solution to implement. It's just a practice change. It doesn't require any additional money. And so these trees would still be within the public right-of-way on the lawn side of the sidewalk. And this will result in some reduced conflicts. So because those trees are set back from the sidewalk, the street, the overhead utilities, we'll see less of those tree wire conflicts, those tree sidewalk conflicts, because again, those trees are set back. So it will just generally take longer for those roots to start heaving sidewalk slabs. We'll see reduced car-tree conflicts, not just good for the tree, also good for whoever's driving the car. And we'll see reduced conflicts just resulting from our traffic volume, like salt stress and exhaust. And just generally increased overall health, structure, and longevity of street trees while minimizing conflicts with other infrastructure. That is basically the definition of a hyperfunctional tree. And this is an example of where this practice is implemented regularly. This is Paramus in Bergen County. They are pretty legendary for having a shade tree easement that allows them to plant further back than the public right-of-way. But many of the municipalities that we work with have public right-of-ways that extend beyond the sidewalk. So I think this can be implemented in many places without a policy change. And you can see here that those trees are set back from the wires, so they're not getting pruned so aggressively for that line clearance. They're set back from the sidewalk a little bit as well, so they're not throwing slabs around as soon as they would be if they were stuffed in that little planting strip. So another solution here is to move sidewalks. This one is a little bit more involved and is definitely easier to implement in a new development versus an existing one, but let's talk about it anyways. So moving sidewalks where practical. So to where? On one side of the street in low traffic areas or along the curb. Obviously, this is not everywhere. This is a great solution for a low traffic, maybe a dead end road with 6 houses on it. If there doesn't need to be a sidewalk on 2 sides of the street, maybe we don't have to have one there. In a high-density urban area where there's lots of pedestrians, this won't work. But this is an example of where this is currently implemented. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see over on the left side of the screen there is an asphalt sidewalk to the left of that bright yellow curb. There's also a school over on the left, so that sidewalk is necessary to get the children safely to and from school. But because it's only on one side of the street, that means those trees on the other side are not limited in their below-ground space. And it also means less tree sidewalk conflicts. That also means a higher proportion of the public right-of-way is beyond that sidewalk on the lawn side. So trees there, again, can be set back further from the street and away from those street-side stressors. So these solutions are all well and good if you're in suburbia and there's not a high density of people. But what about our really urban areas where space is truly at a premium? We can be rethinking our sidewalks to be more tree-friendly. The technology exists. I know both Dr. Gaboski and Dr. Basic talked about it this morning, but 4 pieces of technology that can be used to increase accessible soil to trees and in their sidewalk infrastructure are structural soil, permeable pavements, soil cells, and soak-away crates. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit. So as Dr. Basic explained this morning, structural soil works something like this. There are a lot of proprietary products out there. I think Dr. Basic and Dr. Gaboski both talked about CU structural soil, but there's also sand-based structural soils that are effective as well. And the concept here is that sand or stone bears the weight of the pavement above it and can be compacted to that engineering standard, but it retains pore space with air and water that is accessible to trees. So it meets the needs of that gray built infrastructure, but also meets the needs of our green infrastructure, so trees can grow and provide a higher level of services to the community. This is what that looks like. Just looks like dirt with some rocks in it. But again, can be compacted to meet the needs of that engineering piece and the trees. Another piece of technology is permeable pavements. These can be implemented by themselves or in conjunction with these other pieces of technology. So this is outside the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., a little bit of a gray picture because this was a weird weather day in March. But you can see in the tree pit there's a different color pavement. So that's a porous pavement that allows for the exchange of air and water between the atmosphere and the soil. And this is a really high pedestrian area, so this has the added benefit of people can walk over it without compacting the soil, and the tree can have access to that soil underneath. I don't know what use restrictions exist here, but ideally that permeable pavement extends well beyond the tree pit. The next piece of technology that can address our trees and sidewalks and increase soil volume for trees are soil cells. Again, like the structural soils, there are quite a lot of proprietary products out there, but the basic concept is that there's a structure kind of like a milk crate, and it has uncompacted soil in it, and it's not filled up quite all the way. So that milk crate-like structure bears the weight of the pavement above it, but has uncompacted soil in it that allows for tree growth. The added benefit here is that uncompacted soil can hold a whole lot more moisture than a compacted soil. So in addition to supporting tree growth, this becomes a piece of stormwater management infrastructure because water can be directed into these areas and retained and then used by the tree. So this is a hyper-functional system that is designed to maximize the stormwater benefits of trees. Our last piece of technology are soak-away crates. Dr. Gaboski touched on them briefly, and they look something like this. It's basically a crate underneath parking lots or turf, the like, and it stores water for a period of time before it gets released later or directed somewhere else. Like he mentioned, these haven't really been implemented with large maturing shade trees, but I believe the possibility exists. They're both pieces of infrastructure that are built for stormwater management, so I imagine that there is the possibility to integrate them and improve the efficacy of both. So again, the issue here is our tree environmental service yield is really limited by soil rooting volume, and some ways to address that are planting trees on the lawn side of the street, moving our sidewalks where we can, and rethinking our sidewalks where there's easier solutions are not possible. And I want to emphasize one more piece with this rethinking sidewalks. That's a pretty involved project. And it is absolutely necessary when doing something like that to make sure that you have a team of qualified experts to implement it. Ideally, you'd probably want an arborist, a landscape architect, an engineer, maybe a hydrologist. But it's necessary because you don't want to end up spending a lot of money and not getting those results that you're looking for. So our next big ecological interaction is trees and overhead wires, which I know is everyone's favorite topic. So the problem is that overhead utility management does not allow for hyperfunctional trees. And I want to emphasize this is not because utility foresters are evil, it's because we as a society have a very low tolerance for power outages. And that's only increased and will continue to increase. So some ways to address that are using our principles of right tree, right place. I touched on this before. We can be planting smaller trees underneath overhead utilities to minimize that tree-wire conflict. And this works really well in some areas and not so well in other areas. On a really busy street, planting a small tree underneath lines tends to get in the way of pedestrians and street traffic. And because it's a small maturing tree, it will never get that clearance from below that a large tree will get. So it works sometimes, but isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution. Another solution here is in maximizing site use. And this gets back to our idea of a hyperfunctional tree. A small tree with no overhead wires is a waste of a planting spot because that space can be used for a larger tree that will provide a higher level of services because we're thinking about maximizing every unit of our urban forest system. So let's talk about small versus large maturing trees. Small trees provide less environmental services, they have a shorter service life, but they have that same initial investment in planting. So we get a lower return per tree on the environmental services. So the bottom line here is we should only be planting small trees when we can't plant big ones. Another solution here is using private property. And I'm not going to go into this now because we're going to talk about it more in depth later, but generally on private property, we have less of those overhead restrictions. So we can be thinking about how to incentivize canopy away from those wires. And lastly, another solution is rethinking wires. Kind of like rethinking sidewalks, this is a pretty high cost solution and is kind of like the last resort when these other easier solutions can't be implemented. So considering wire alternatives where no other options exist. One wire alternatives is burying wires. I have heard this referred to as costing $1 million a mile, but I imagine that maybe there's the possibility for cost sharing between a utility provider and a municipality. I mean, I'm just over here thinking that a utility provider would reduce their costs in vegetation management. So maybe that's a discussion that can be had. Another solution here is a non-wires alternative. This is a little bit of a misnomer. It just means no additional wires as the demand for electricity increases. Disclaimer, I am not a utility provider, so I am not an expert in this methodology. But an example of where this has been implemented is in the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. So instead of adding more overhead wires as the demand for electricity increased, they used a microgrid system to supplement demand when it was necessary. And just kind of an open question here. What about the rapidly emerging tree-solar panel conflict? How many municipalities in New Jersey have a protocol for determining where we're prioritizing trees and where we're prioritizing solar panels? These are both parts of our sustainable future, but they're not always compatible because trees cast shade. In my opinion, we should be prioritizing solar panels where we have a lot of built infrastructure. Like Dr. Grabowski was saying earlier, parking lots, commercial areas, industrial areas. And we should be prioritizing trees where people live, because trees make our communities more livable. So again, the issue is our overhead utility management does not allow for hyperfunctional trees, and some ways to address that are using the principles of right tree, right place, maximizing site use by only planting small trees when we have to, encouraging trees on private property, and rethinking wire solutions when those easier approaches are not available. Our next ecological interaction is trees and public opinion. So the problem is that people are reluctant to bear the costs of trees. Trees have tangible benefits, tangible costs, and intangible benefits. It's kind of difficult to see something like stormwater management. So let's just talk about Manhattan versus New Jersey and the prevalent public opinions that are in both those places. In Manhattan, we generally have less tangible costs of trees. For one, the proportion of trees that are on public property is much higher. And even if there's a tree on public property, if someone lives in a shoebox apartment on the 86th floor, they're probably not worried about raking leaves or the tree branches falling on their car because they don't have a car. They also, in Manhattan, have more tangible benefits of the trees. Just again, because of that density, people just tend to value their green space a little bit more. So all of this results in an improved public perception of trees. This is in comparison to New Jersey. We have very tangible costs of trees. So even if someone has a public tree adjacent to their property and they're not paying for the maintenance of it, they might be worried about it falling on their car or doing damage to their house, or maybe they just really don't like raking leaves. And so this is in comparison to our intangible benefits, just because we have more green space than Manhattan. People don't value it quite so much. All of this results in a poorer public perception of trees. And I want to emphasize that obviously this does not capture every individual in New Jersey and Manhattan. I imagine right now I'm talking to the part of New Jersey that doesn't get described by this. But the question here is, how can we make the benefits of our trees tangible and the costs bearable? One way to do so is through education. This is a big piece of addressing that public opinion issue. But it can also have a limited reach and impact because it's more likely to convince people who are already pro-tree. So we need to use other methods as well. One of those other solutions is implementing proactive maintenance. So managing our trees proactively to reduce the likelihood and frequency of failure. Not all tree failures are predictable, but we can be addressing the ones that are. And how we do that is, first, by addressing high-risk hazards in a timely manner so they don't fail and do damage. And we can also structurally prune our young trees. With a little bit of money and 15 to 30 minutes, a young tree with structural defects can be corrected to extend its service life so that in the future it becomes less likely to fail and its service life isn't limited by a structural defect. And lastly, we want to be implementing systematic pruning rotations so that every tree in a municipality is assessed and its maintenance needs addressed on an established rotation cycle. So how do you know what trees pose a high risk? Ask a licensed tree expert. Licensed tree experts in New Jersey are the only people who are qualified to tell you which trees pose a high risk to public safety and which don't. And better yet, ask a licensed tree expert that specializes in tree risk assessment. One way you know that is if your licensed tree expert is tree risk assessment qualified by the ISA. Oh no, my clicker. Okay. So the summary piece here is that if we have less frequent tree failures because we're proactively managing our trees, and we have highly visible maintenance activities that build trust between a constituency and a government, then we have a more favorable public opinion. So another solution here is to use economic incentives. As far as I know, these aren't really being implemented anywhere, but I don't think that's a reason not to talk about them. Oh no. So economic incentives we're also going to talk about more with that private property piece, because not only do they make the benefits of trees more tangible, but they can be used to incentivize canopy on private property. So the issue with trees and private property is that most of our available planting space is on private property and not in our public parks and on the public right-of-way. So if we're focusing all our resources on public lands and street trees, we're inherently reducing the benefits of our urban forest. Across the US, only 10 to 20% of our urban forest is on public lands. And within our New Jersey land use, about 27% of our state is urban. So that's what we're talking about today, the urban forest. And within that urban land use category, about 65% of land is residential. 35% is other urban areas, such as commercial land, industrial land, etc. And in our urban space, we have almost 900,000 acres of pervious surface. So we can use this as a proxy for available planting space because it's the area in our urban matrix that is not already covered by a building, a parking lot, a road. And of that almost 900,000 acres, 70% of it is on residential land, which is overwhelmingly privately owned. And that's not even looking at the other 30% of urban land that may be privately owned as well. So the question here is, how do we incentivize private landowners, particularly residential landowners, to plant and maintain large shade trees? Well, to do that is to make it easy. So remove homeowner barriers to planting and maintaining large shade trees. This doesn't have to be a high-cost solution. It can just be a diversion of planting resources into a private planting project instead. So one way to do that is by providing trees and planting them and making it as easy as for a homeowner or landlord to sign up their name on a list. There's a municipality that we work with that has a similar program where they do a cost sharing with the homeowner to plant a tree. The homeowner gets to choose from a limited palette of species, and they work with the homeowner to decide where that tree is best suited on their property, and they coordinate the contractor and the installation of that tree. Another way that we can remove homeowner barriers specifically for maintaining large shade trees is by offering grants or some other financial assistance for homeowner hazard tree maintenance. As I'm sure you all know, trees get very expensive very quickly. And this can be a pretty large burden on a high proportion of the population. So can we be providing some sort of assistance to reduce that green burden on homeowners and landlords and to make it easier to maintain large maturing shade trees? Another way that we can address this issue is through homeowner municipal maintenance contract buy-ins. This idea was introduced to me through Pam Zipsey, and the concept here is that when a municipality goes to prune an area of town or a street, that they offer a buy-in to the homeowner. So the homeowner can still be paying for their maintenance of their trees on their property, but because it's in a bulk contract, we're using that idea of an economy of scale to reduce the cost per tree and reduce the maintenance cost for that homeowner in comparison to if they were to get an independent estimate on that tree maintenance. So the bottom line here is we're trying to target the movable middle. In urban forestry, we hear a lot from the two sides of the trees, right? The tree lovers and the tree haters. We don't hear a lot from the people who haven't thought about trees. So can we make it easy enough to plant and maintain large maturing shade trees that this movable middle does so? Another solution here is using economic incentives. I touched on this before because it also plays into that public opinion, focuses on making the benefits of trees tangible. So one way to do so is to offer tax breaks to homeowners. As far as I know, this has not been implemented anywhere, but I think it's a possibility. And maybe there's a tax break for maintaining a minimum number of large maturing shade trees and or for planting large maturing shade trees. So there's an incentive not just to keep the trees you have, but also to plant new ones. Another way that we could go about doing this is counting trees in personal carbon trading markets. Again, I don't think this has been implemented anywhere to my knowledge, but I didn't come up with the idea, so other people are thinking about it. And I know that residential energy use is 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And we also have transportation costs, emissions, that are associated with residential land use and individuals. So can we implement some sort of a personal carbon trading market and count trees in it so that we're incentivizing people to plant and maintain large maturing shade trees so that we can get those co-benefits of trees, that temperature moderation and stormwater management aspect that our urban forest provides us with? And the bottom line here is we're trying to make homeowners tolerate the cost of trees. A last solution here is using rules and regulations. We have more of these right now. And the goal here is to make it difficult to remove existing canopy. So one way to do so is to have a zoning restriction, maybe something called a canopy or urban forest zone. In New York City, they have something called a special natural area district, or a SNAD. And this regulates removal of trees and other development on private property. In order to get a tree removed, if you live in a SNAD, you have to get an ISA certified arborist say that it poses a hazard to public safety. We also can use tree removal and replacement ordinances. We have a lot of these in New Jersey right now, but they tend to focus on trees that are nearer to the end of that plateau, that are nearing the end of their service life, because often it's more costly to remove those large trees near the end of their service life than it is to remove young trees that are maybe establishing or have just established. So maybe we can take another look at these and use them to protect not just our current hyperfunctional canopy, but also our future hyperfunctional canopy. And the goal here, again, is just to curb loss of that existing hyperfunctional canopy and reduce the indiscriminate removal of shade trees. So again, the issue is that most available planting space is on private property. In New Jersey, 70% of our planting space is on residential land specifically. And some ways we can address this are by removing homeowner barriers to planting and maintaining large shade trees, using economic incentives to make the benefits of trees more tangible, and using rules and regulations to curb loss of our existing canopy. So now we've covered 4 big ecological interactions in our urban forest. We're going to move into assembling solutions that address these interactions. So the first one I have here is groves and tiny forests. So maybe instead of planting trees in traditional alleys, we can be planting them in groves nestled in between properties. So this could preserve space for homeowner visibility and grass visibility. A lot of people don't want a tree in front of their house because they want their house to be seen, or they're really, really proud of their grass. So this can potentially address that public perception issue. There's also potentially better storm tolerance with planting trees in a grove because they have an intertwined root system and a forest wind dynamic where the wind goes up and over trees as opposed to through them. They could also be easier to maintain as a group as in comparison to individual trees. And if we can add in understory layers and leave tree debris on the ground, then we're doing nutrient cycling in addition to having an organism that's providing us with environmental services. And we're also increasing our carbon storage in the soil. Our soil in urban and suburban areas is a hugely underutilized carbon sink. And again, our tiny forests offer us a higher level of environmental services than individual trees. I am not the first person to come up with this tiny forest idea. Liz Stewart, who just won an award recently. She also has come up with this idea independently. And there's also a famous Japanese botanist, Dr. Akira Miyawaki, who pioneered a method for establishing tiny forests. And so his method has been implemented widely across Japan and in other places in Asia. And it involves a highly dense planting of native canopy, sub-canopy, shrub, and herbaceous species. And they all compete, and so they establish really quickly. I encourage you to look more into that. It's really interesting. So this is an example of what this might look like in a streetscape. So I've used some of the things we talked about earlier. The sidewalk is against the curb on the right side there, and we have overhead wires. So all of our tree limiting factors are on one side of the street, and we've used the principles of right tree, right place to implement a grove of small maturing trees underneath those overhead wires and next to the sidewalk. That leaves us on the other side of the street with enough room to plant a grove of large maturing shade trees to provide us with a higher level of environmental services. So of those ecological interactions we talked about, this solution addresses roots, wires, and public opinion. A next solution here is thinking about new places for trees and forests. So one of those is in cemeteries. Sometimes these are publicly owned, sometimes they're privately owned. So maybe for those privately owned ones, we can be thinking about using economic incentives or regulations and requirements to get our canopy onto them. These are two cemeteries where there is currently extensive canopy, Mercer Cemetery in Trenton and Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. This is a picture of Mercer Cemetery, and as you can see, there's pretty much a closed canopy there. I do apologize for the lack of green ceiling. This picture was taken in January. But in addition to this functioning primarily as a cemetery space, it also functions as a hyper-functional green space because of that extensive canopy cover. And especially in the case of Greenwood Cemetery, this can also be a recreation space for the community. Another place we can be thinking about for implementing more trees and forests is in highway medians. So maybe we can be addressing these like an afforestation project and using silvicultural approaches or tiny forest approaches to establishing vegetation. And again, our tiny forests offer us a higher level of environmental services than individual trees. This is an aerial photo of part of the Garden State Parkway. I'm not sure how many of you drove down this to get here, but this is around exit 109. And those little tiny green dots off to the right there are arborvitae trees, which is a medium maturing tree, and it is widely overplanted in the region. So this is not an example of hyperfunctional green space, but it could be. Can we establish forests on our highway medians, of course adhering to those necessary sight lines and other primary use restrictions of this area? But that could provide us with a higher level of environmental services than this vacant lawn area and some arborvitae trees. Another new place that we can think about for trees and forests is in creation of new medians. So again, coming back to that idea of our hyperfunctional trees. One hyperfunctional tree offers us a higher level of services than multiple lousy trees. So if we're condensing all of the available planting space in a public right-of-way into one area, we could be supporting a higher level of environmental services than maybe splitting it between two areas. So this is an example of that. As you can see, we have a pretty large median in the middle of the road there, and it's supporting some large mature Zelkova trees. And this is in comparison to that tiny little tree pit over there on the left with a tree in it. And you can see here that this median doesn't have really above or below ground restrictions. That's a pretty large available soil volume to those trees. And there are some cases where the lines run down the middle of the street, but most often they're on one side or the other. So of these ecological interactions we talked about, this solution addresses all four: roots, wires, public opinion, and private property. And something I want to emphasize here that I talked about a little bit earlier with rethinking our sidewalks and wire systems is that implementing trees and forests in new places probably requires use of a highly expert team. Because there are other use restrictions to these spaces, like highway medians, we need sightline visibility, so working across disciplines and taking into account the other requirements of the space. Another solution here is thinking about new development and development incentives. We can expect with climate change to see a lot of human migration. So we should be thinking about our new developments. And again, Dr. Grabowski touched on this earlier. He really set me up for all my points today. So one way to do so is to incentivize and regulate hyperfunctional green space in new developments. So again, maybe this comes in the form of a tax break for maintaining tiny forests or other hyperfunctional green space. And maybe there's a rule or regulation that requires a minimum amount of green space, but there's an incentive to go beyond that. We can also be using rules and requirements. These exist to a certain extent. There are rules that mandate a certain percentage of a new development remains open space. But can we go one step further and require that that open space be maintained in a hyper-functional way? And maybe that comes in the form of a management plan, so that those benefits are not just felt for today, but they continue into the future. So of our ecological interactions, this addresses roots, wires, and private property. Again, just because on private property, we tend to have less of those above and below ground restrictions. So those are some solutions that I've presented. So now it's your turn. So in coming up with solutions that address urban forestry issues, we should be thinking about our ecological interactions. So 4 that I talked about today are roots, wires, public opinion, and private property. But these are not the only ecological interactions in our urban forest system. For instance, can we be thinking about the role of urban forests in mitigating the widespread loss of our insect and bird populations? Or perhaps in addressing air quality issues? Or maybe it is in our carbon market system. The possibilities here are really endless because it is such a complex system. So lastly, let's talk about our goal one more time. Our primary goal in urban forest management should be to mitigate the local effects of climate change. So back to our idea of our lousy tree versus our hyperfunctional tree. Our lousy tree offers us a low level of services for a shorter period of time in comparison to our hyperfunctional tree, which has a longer service life and provides a higher level of environmental services. But the urban forest is not about the individual tree. It's about populations of trees. So this is what a population of lousy trees might look like. There's a low level of environmental services. There's pretty quick turnover rate because each of these trees have shorter service lives. And there's a low level of environmental services. And we can think about mid-tier populations, kind of the middle ground, where there's a little bit of a lesser turnover rate, a little longer service life, and kind of a medium level of environmental services. But our goal here is to get hyperfunctional populations. So that is where every tree has a longer service life and provides a higher level of environmental services, so our population as a whole is providing us with more environmental services. And when we're having more trees or less trees providing more environmental services, we can now be investing more per tree. So maybe some of those really costly solutions can be implemented because we're investing more in each tree and getting a higher level of benefits overall. So to recap one more time, we talked about where we are in urban forestry management, how our main focus is the street tree ally, and we can talk about 4 ecological interactions: roots, wires, public opinion, and private property, and how to assemble multifaceted solutions that address these and other issues to mitigate the local effects of climate change. And I want to revisit my ask for you at the beginning of this presentation, which was to be open to new possibilities. And I want to amend that a little bit. And I'm going to ask that you go and try something new. Maybe something in my presentation really spoke to you and you said, hey, yeah, that's something we could do. Maybe nothing did. But maybe there's something else that you can think of that would be a good fit for your community. We have 564 municipalities in New Jersey. So if everyone is trying to be innovative in our urban forestry management, then together we can create a New Jersey that is more suited to the reality of climate change and making our communities more livable. Thank you. So before I open it up to questions, I want to give a special thanks to Paul Cowie, Dr. Jason Grabowski, and Pam Zipsey for helping me and supporting me in the development of this. So are there any questions? Any questions? Yes.
How did you decide on your goal?
How did I decide on my goal? Well, in my mind, climate change is the most important problem of our time. And it's big and it's complex. So there are a lot of goals in urban forestry management. I think you talked about them quite a bit earlier in the SFI presentation. But I think climate change should always be the number one priority, and how do we make our communities more livable? And then all of those other goals kind of come second. To quote Dr. Grabowski, form follows function. Did that address your question?
Just in a climate where it's still challenging to talk about climate change with a lot of audiences, I just think it's an interesting choice for the goal, as stated.
Okay. Anyone else? Right there.
I usually can be heard, but okay. We're in an area that's undergoing, a shore area that's undergoing a lot of development, and there's a real economic mix of people now, right? There are long-term residents that don't have a lot of money, and then there are residents building million-dollar houses who have, relatively speaking, a lot of money.
Yeah.
So our issue is tree maintenance. We have a good canopy, but it needs to be maintained. It generally falls on the homeowner. Have you had any experience with means testing for municipalities to help? I don't mind helping the woman who's owned there for 70 years and is on Social Security. I do mind helping the person just built a $4 million house.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you have any experience with means testing, or is anybody doing it?
I personally do not. I think maybe a good place to start would be finding someone who has experience in equitable implementation of anything, because maybe they would have a really good framework for how to assess someone's mean and whether or not they qualify for whatever program you're looking to implement to help those people who need it. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.